Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, as we've heard, the Prime Minister's Florence speech has provoked a deluge of reaction. Does this really change anything? However, I spoke yesterday to David Davis, our main negotiator. I started off by asking him to explain what difference there was, if any, between the Prime Minister's speech this week and the one she gave at Lancaster House a year ago.
Well, in strict terms, there's no difference because it's encompassed in Lancaster House. But the important things in the speech were, one, laying out in detail the transition, the implementation period, the fact we're going to take up to 2 years to make sure that businesses, government, people are all ready for the change. The second thing is about treatment of European citizens here. We're writing the treaty into the law and allowing British courts to take account of what European courts do. And the third thing is we've said we're going to meet our international responsibilities. One of those responsibilities is that the European Union, with us leaving, will have its complete budget structure disrupted because we're leaving in the middle of a budget, and we're going to help put that right. Those are the three things, the three big things.
Let me come to all of them then, bit by bit. Let's start with the money, which you've said in the past is the most difficult issue of all. Now, is it broadly speaking right that staying in for another 2 years, in effect, in the single market and paying to do that costs us about £20 billion?
Well, if that's what we did, that's what it would cost roughly. About 10 billion a year net is a number. But whether we do it that way or some other way, it will depend on negotiation.
Now, there was another very, very interesting change in language, I thought, which was in the past the Prime Minister has said, and you've said, we will meet our legal obligations. And now we're saying that we will meet our commitments. So we will meet all the obligations that we entered into as EU members financially. And that could include things like pension contributions, it could joint programmes overseas, it could be structural funds in Italy going ahead and those kind of things.
Well, no, be careful.
Michel Barnier has said he wants detail on all of this.
Oh, yes, no. I mean, look, whenever you have a negotiation, we're in the middle of a negotiation, and we've had the most positive response to our initiative, the Prime Minister's initiative, that we've ever had. But of course...
Slightly chilly still.
Oh, of course. It's a negotiation. You know, they'll always say we want more. There are two categories, if you like. Two categories. Number one, the current budget. Right? That's going on at the moment. We're in the middle of that. And people have done things, started projects and so on the basis of that. We understand that. Beyond that, I mean, things like pensions and others, these are debatable, to say the least, arguable, to say the least. And indeed, the reason...
But the Prime Minister has said we will honour our commitments.
Honour our obligations and our commitments. But, you know, exactly what they are, I mean, the interpretation being put on this by the Union is, of course, the maximalist one. We had this ridiculous number of 100 billion thrown out at the beginning. They put the kitchen sink in.
If that's ridiculous, are we looking at 40 billion? Because that is the figure that's on the front pages.
I know it is, and they sort of made that up too. And I'm not going to do an actual number on it. It'd be ridiculous to do that. But we have a fairly clear idea where we're going on this. But of course, a lot of this is subject to legal challenge and debate, and that's what will happen.
And to being absolutely clear, this is the very same money that Boris Johnson said they could go whistle for.
You'll have to ask Boris about that.
It is the same money, isn't it?
I don't know what Boris was talking about there. But the simple truth is, Boris signed up to this. Boris was there on Friday saying, okay, look, you know, this is a good outcome, this is the right thing. So ask him, by all means.
His people are saying that his now famous essay in the Telegraph helped change the tone for this debate, and he's had a big influence on it.
Well, I have to say that the policy in the paper, in the Prime Minister's speech, have been coming for a long time. I mean, some of them, a transition, we were designing right back at the beginning of the year. Some of it we've been designing months ago. I don't think there's been any change of policy in the last few weeks.
Did you, like Amber Rudd, look at this piece and think, aha, a bit of backseat driving? Did you think this was a helpful intervention in the debate?
My car's only got 2 seats.
Yeah, but did you think it was a helpful intervention?
Well, no, it's fine. It was on your programme, wasn't it? It was a very good interview, I thought.
So you agree with her? It was backseat driving?
I said it was a good interview. Yeah.
On the rights of UK citizens, the Prime Minister said in Florence that they were going to have the same rights as they have now. Did she mean that? Because there has been a debate about this. In some areas, if I was an EU citizen and I married somebody who was also a EU citizen or from somewhere else, I could bring them to this country without challenge. If I'm British and I marry somebody from Ethiopia, I can't bring them to that country.
Exactly.
So there's a difference. And do they keep those extra rights after?
No, this is still subject to negotiation, but no, in the long run that won't happen. I mean, we have got to get to a situation where British citizens and the 3 million or so Europeans who are here are on a level standing. But as I say, we're negotiating how we can solve the biggest issues here.
And on the same issue, the Prime Minister said that British courts would take account of European Court of Justice rulings and jurisdiction. Mr Barnier and his team have said we must be under the ECJ's jurisdiction.
That's not going to happen.
What does take account mean? That's
not going to happen. If you've got, basically the aim with the withdrawal treaty will be to have British citizens and in Europe and European citizens in Britain treated broadly similarly. They won't be exactly the same because they're in different countries under different legal systems, but they're as similarly as we can. We are not, under any circumstances, going to be accepting the overarching supremacy of the European Court. That's going.
But British judges will be required by law, presumably, when they're engaging in these cases.
Allowed, I think, is probably a better word. I mean,
to watch, but they're allowed at the moment.
Yeah,
so it must go beyond that.
But we're making that explicit. We're making that explicit. The point about it is we're making that explicit. We will allow the judges to interpret the treaty, if you like, in the courts. And in that respect, they would, of course, naturally look at European Union decisions.
OK, let's look again at the big picture, if you might. March 2019, we leave the EU.
Yep.
But if you look around in March 2019, when it comes to free movement of people, when it comes to the amount of money we're paying into the EU, and it comes to EU regulations, not much will have changed. You won't be able to spot any great difference. That's
the part of the purpose of the implementation period is to give people time.
So that's true.
Adjust. No, take the free movement issue, and I'm sure this will be controversial. We'll be debating this in the negotiation. But what we've said is, we want registration. We want to register people who come.
And they've said no already.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. We'll get to that point when we actually negotiate the implementation period.
So we are going to register every non-British EU citizen living here, or just people coming in for the first time?
Coming in.
And they're going to have to sign up. The EU says that is against European law because it is discriminatory.
Well, actually, one will be outside the European law by then. So this is a question of negotiation, and maybe comes under the arbitration we talked about before. But that's the intention.
All right, let's talk about the big picture when it comes to sort of trade and so forth. There seems to be a real problem between those people who want to stay as close as possible to the EU to get frictionless access to the markets, if you like, to be part of the EU's magnetic force field, and those who say, no, we want to break away completely and look at the rest of the world. Where on that spectrum are you?
Oh, I'm bang in the middle, I should think.
Boring.
I thought you'd think that. Look, the issue will be to what extent and how our regulations in the UK affecting markets will be similar to those in the EU. The truth is we start at exactly the same position. That's what we keep saying this. We're exactly the same place, but we'll manage the divergence.
And presumably we have to diverge or there's no point in leaving.
No, of course we will diverge. We'll do things our own way.
But as we diverge, we can't have frictionless access to the European market, can we?
Well, you say that. I mean, the first thing to say is, I mean, do these changes, any changes we put in place, actually affect the competitive balance between the UK and the EU? And indeed on their side too, if they change something. Let's imagine, I mean, this won't happen, but let's imagine they suddenly decide they're going to subsidise lots of industries. We'd have an objection to that. That's where this arbitration panel would come in. We say, no, you can't do that. Or if you do, then there's a cost to it. Now that's where it ceases to be frictionless. If one side misbehaves, as it were, with respect to the other. But generally speaking, there are plenty of trade deals where you've got frictionless trade, which is subject to overarching rules, but nevertheless you leave the government in charge of its own business, as it were.
Looking back at the Florence speech, was there anything in it at all that couldn't have been said a year ago? Haven't you wasted a year as a government?
Oh, on the contrary. I mean, bear in mind we're in the middle of a negotiation, and that negotiation is ongoing. There are times when you test each other's mettle, and that takes time.
You triggered Article 50 pretty quickly, and then almost nothing visibly seems to have moved in the negotiation process, except they haven't given up anything. We've given up quite a lot.
Well, that's not true, and you'll see. I mean, you'll see it. Better to judge this near the end than the beginning. This is a 2-year negotiation. 19 months of negotiation.
So what do you say to a keen Brexit voter who said 5 years after the vote we will still in effect be pretty much inside the EU, paying in money with free movement?
No, that's not true. I mean, firstly, in 2019, we will leave. We'll come out from under the jurisdiction and the lawmaking of the European Union. We'll have a couple of years which allows people to adapt. Most of the people who voted Brexit will say to you, we want a practical, upbeat, real, effective Brexit. That's what we're going to get.
David Davis, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, you might not realise it with all the giddy excitement at this conference, but the Labour Party isn't actually in power, and by the time of the next election, it could have spent more than a decade in opposition. To talk about the long road back to government, we're joined now by three of the finest backbenchers in the Labour Party ranks. Clive Lewis, Caroline Flint and Lisa Nandy. I'm on your Christmas card list now, I'm sure. Clive, let's start with you, shall we? Party unity is clearly going to be a topic, and is always a topic when it comes to this particular political movement. How unified behind the leader is the Labour Party at the moment?
I'd say most of the members are, obviously, the vast majority of them. I think in the PLP it's probably a little shakier. And I think you have to understand why. We've just been through a kind of quite bruising 2 years, and politics is going through vast changes. You know, the country's going through vast changes, the world's going through vast changes, and there is a transition taking place. It's a wobbly one, it's shaky, and it's been quite bruising. But I think what this conference is about is drawing a line underneath that and saying we're a party, a government in waiting, and how do we now begin to define what is the future and the offer that we're going to put out there to people for the challenges of the 21st century.
I mean, what are the risks, Caroline, if that line is not drawn underneath, underscored, highlighted and then repeated?
I think what is clear since the general election earlier this year is that Jeremy actually ran a very good campaign. I think he capitalised on a disastrous campaign and lead by Theresa May, and for all intents and purposes Jeremy is our leader and will continue to be our leader, I think, into the next general election. What we have to show is that despite the wins that we won in 2017, we didn't win the election. We haven't won an election since 2005. So we have to show that and prove that we are a government in waiting. And to do that, we have to make sure that we are in touch on things like Brexit, but also we're looking beyond that to the other policies that actually people want to hear about and talk about that affect their families and future. And I think, you know, a number of the different discussions this week, it's going to be about Brexit, but there's a whole load of other areas on education and health that we need to talk about too.
We'll move on to policy in a couple of minutes, but Lisa and Andy, I suppose the question is exactly how that unity within the party is brought about, be it by changes to the rule book or by permitting those dissenting voices to exist within the broad church of the party.
Yeah, I mean, we've always been a broad church, and I think we've been at our best.
Slightly narrower these days?
When we are, well, I don't know really. I mean, you were quite narrow under Tony Blair. You only had a very narrow range of voices at the top of the party, but then you did have people like Jeremy Corbyn on the backbenches providing a challenge. And I think actually the Labour Party is stronger for that because it means that we represent a much broader spread of opinion within the party. I suppose I'm a bit more optimistic than Clive, though. I feel like the election really did settle the question of leadership, not just within the membership, but within the PLP. And the reason that it did that is because we all had the experience of going out knocking on doors day after day, new members and old, alongside members of Parliament. We got to know one another as what is essentially a new party, and I think it's built a level of trust that will take us forward and reminded us crucially of what happens when we start focusing on the issues that matter to the people and not just the issues that matter to us. And that's the challenge for this conference and going forward, is not to descend into infighting or start trying to reopen tired questions of leadership or rule changes, but to start thinking about...
You say descend into, I mean, you're already there. I mean, the NEC meeting, you had a Corbyn supporter saying, there are Labour MPs who deserve to be attacked. There are MPs up and down the country. You're hearing murmurs from the CLP about deselection.
Yes.
That doesn't scream unity to me.
I don't accept that because, I've read the newspapers this morning. I've seen absolute nonsense written about a number of people, including myself, about things that we're supposedly saying and doing. But when I get here, the mood is very positive. The people I meet from a broad spread of the party are very supportive and positive and very focused on what we can do to get the Tories out. We're neck and neck in the polls with the Tories. We've got a mountain to climb, there's no question about it. But the idea that any of us should be talking about infighting or what's happening within the Labour Party at the moment seems to me astonishing.
I think a lot of the discussion about deselections by a relatively few number of voices is overblown, and I understand why the media want to seize on every time someone makes a comment that, or even that a leadership bid. I think actually in terms of what the rule changes are happening this week on the threshold for nominations and what have you, if that's going to happen, that's going to happen. What I would say, and this is my personal view, is I do think as a party we should recognise the importance of the different constituent parts, the trade union movement, the PLP, members, but I also actually feel that full members should have more of a say in the leadership of a leader to the party than those who register for a £3, £5 or whatever.
Clive, what do you then see as the role of the PLP moving forward? As I said in my introduction, perhaps I hammed it up a little bit. We've got three of the most talented people within the Labour Party sitting on the back benches at the moment. So what is the role of the PLP to get yourselves into number 10?
I think the role of the PLP, I think it's all... The PLP has historically played a role where, in terms of a parliamentary route to a Labour government, has had them at the vanguard of that. And that's not changed. It's still the same. But I think what has happened is that the party has shifted. We now have one of the largest social democratic parties in the Western world, and I think the rule changes are to reflect those changes and to reflect a kind of growing demand for democracy within, I think, our party and our society at large. The role for the PLP would always be one of partly leadership, but partly, I think, what it does in Parliament to kind of drive forward that policy agenda that is democratically decided by the whole of the Labour Party, the Labour movement, the trade union movement, the membership, and the PLP has a role to play in that. So I don't think we're kind of being pushed out of the way. It's just a rearrangement of how things operate and the influence that different sections of the Labour Party have, and I think that's quite clear.
I think members of Parliament have an additional role, because at the end of the day we are elected by voters who come from all sorts of backgrounds, and for me, as someone who has been a party member since 1979, a very long time, and seen a few things in those decades, our party has to avoid just focusing internally on what's going on inside and look outwards. And there is a lesson for us from every election. One of the things about Tony Blair is the fact is we won elections because we had a broad appeal across the country. So when you talk about a broad church in the Labour Party, it's about how do we make sure we have that broad church of support across the country as well. And MPs have an important role in that, because we have to go out there and listen to our constituents, act on behalf of our constituents, whether they vote Labour or Tory or Green or anything else, and represent as best we can those views. And that is a very important aspect of what we offer and give to the party.
I mean, Lisa, do you think on the kind of the biggest political issue of the day, on Brexit, do you feel that there is sufficient distance between the party position and the government position right now?
Well, I feel like we're leading the government position, actually, and that's probably the best place of all to be. I mean, I actually feel very optimistic about where we are on Brexit. There is a very live debate within the Labour Party that reflects the debate that has happened within the country. We represent both heavily Leave and heavily Remain constituencies, and so if we can get this right in Labour, we can get the right offer for the country. And actually this transitional deal that Keir Starmer set out a few weeks ago that Theresa May has now agreed to seems to me exactly right. You protect jobs, you have no cliff edge, you take time to work through and think through the compromises
you just push it back by 2 years.
Well, not necessarily.
We're leaving, aren't we? So if that's the cliff edge, we are leaving.
But that doesn't have to mean that you throw jobs, workers' rights, environmental protections off the edge of that cliff, not to mention the border with Northern Ireland. And we do need time to get that right. And actually, a number of my colleagues, Clive included, signed a letter to the Observer this morning that said that we should be looking to remain in the single market for the foreseeable future permanently. Now, I don't happen to agree with Clive about that, about setting out that we have that red line above all else at this stage in the negotiations, but it doesn't mean that I disagree with him ideologically on the point about protecting jobs. The question is just how best we do that.
Following on from our discussion about unity and kind of bringing everyone together, I mean, how do you square that circle that you've got at least a third of party members who would, frankly, probably at the very least be dissatisfied with continued membership of the single market, if not absolutely livid about it?
Yeah. It's a difficult issue, and I think what you have to understand is that we're a democratic party, and democracy is a flexible, moving, living entity, and there is always going to be debate on issues, on major issues, and Europe is the most major issue of all in living memory for me. So I see no contradiction between being a unified party working together for government, but also being able to have the debate and move the position. You think about the country, it's moved since the Brexit vote. We've had the general election since. It's moved, and some parts, I think it has. And I think what the Labour Party is doing, and this is why I'm in agreement with the front bench, although I'd like to see it go further, and I think it's partly my job and the job of members and those who want to see us to have the strongest possible relationship with Europe, to keep pushing that boundary. And I think Labour is moving with public opinion. But there's nothing wrong with people inside the party pushing Labour to keep moving that debate forwards.
I think, to be honest, Clive and other colleagues should be more honest. When they talk about the campaign for the single market, and that is full membership of the single market, you cannot leave the European Union and be a member of the single market and the customs union. You just can't do that. So they'd be more honest if they just said campaign to not leave the European Union. And of course there is a party that is supporting that, it's called the Liberals. There has to be an honesty about this. I am entirely at one with Labour's front bench in the recognition that we are leaving the European Union, that there will have to be transition plans, I was saying that a year ago, and also that we will have as much access to the single market as we can and the customs union, but there has to be change to freedom of movement. And I'm afraid the 30-odd people who signed the letter seem to be in denial about that, and I think they should be more upfront and honest, which I think is a principal position, which is a campaign to stop us leaving the European Union.
Lisa, any thoughts?
Well, having said that we're completely united.
Well, it's true. It's true.
Okay,
this is true.
Here's where I agree with Caroline. I agree absolutely that we've got the position right within the Labour Party, that we accept the result of the referendum, despite the fact that the vast majority of us didn't want it, and that now our job is to get the best possible deal that we can. But to be honest, I think that most of the people who signed that letter, Clive included, hold that position. We campaigned very hard to stay in the EU. We lost that. And now we've got to work out how we get the best future for Britain. And this is a question of strategy, not of ideology.
The single market and not leave the European Union.
Well, we don't know. That's the honest answer. No, but that is the honest answer. This is a negotiation.
This is an unprecedented situation.
But you don't want to accept changes to freedom of movement, do you?
No, and I tell you, we want to go further.
So therefore, you do not respect the vote.
But the letter does.
No,
the letter absolutely does. It says that we should work with European colleagues.
Seriously.
I just want to make another point. On occasion, sometimes it appears that the Labour Party is divided and that you don't take advantage of clear attack lines given by the Conservatives. Would you agree?
No, not at all. Well, maybe some of the... But I think
isn't the simple fact, Clive, that at some point the party is going to have to bite the bullet, is going to have to be absolutely crystal clear about what its position is, not just for the transition period, but what happens after that point.
Yes, indeed, it will. And the issue of freedom of movement, on which Caroline and myself have vast differences of opinion.
Well, what's our vast difference of opinion?
I actually believe in the freedom of movement.
Right, so you don't think we should manage migration
Surely you can agree about whether you disagree.
No,
with Europe, with Europe, we have the freedom of movement, and it's about. You want. So if you want to, what you're talking about when you're talking about managing migration, which always comes back down to, ultimately, always comes back down to, and you're not going to like to hear this, but it always comes back down to something the left in this country has had very much difficulty with, which is that it is ultimately about racism.
No,
that's what it comes down to. It comes down to racism.
No, it's not.
Yes, it does. And I'm afraid to say,
Keir Starmer's been pretty clear about this. That he wants to see controls on immigration.
Indeed.
This is not about this is managed migration with the rest of the world. Yes, but with the European Union, this is a retrograde back step.
Diana said she recognises, and Jeremy has said, and I'm absolutely at one with them on this, that there has to be some recognition that there needs to be some changes to the way we handle movement from the EU.
And you can do that within the European Union because the European Union is already discussing this.
No, because the thing is, Clive, what you seem to not accept is people do not want to have our migration settled by 27 other member states. They want us to be able to have the right to decide that.
Okay, so let me just, this is a very important point.
You don't want any controls on immigration, clearly. You don't want any controls.
You want to take back the flawed democracy from Europe and hand it over in a trade deal to Trump and the corporates on their immigration policy.
I think you're shifting it.
No, I'm not, because sovereignty isn't something that you
don't want any immigration controls at all.
No, I do want immigration controls.
But
I want
not
freedom of movement within Europe.
I think it is fair to say that there is a conversation that will continue within the Labour movement. Lisa Nandy, Caroline Flint, Clive Lewis, thank you all very much for being with us.
Still hoping Ken Clark's going to make it, fingers crossed. First, Allegra and Screeny. Okay, so after that speech, the big unanswered question is what on earth our future trading relationship looks like. So Norway, she's pretty much ruled out Norway. I'm going to give you a long list of reasons why she's ruled them out, free movement, EU regulations, payments and so on. That's why Boris Johnson exploded last week. That's not happening. But in her speech, she was pretty rude about the Canadian model. Why? Well, it took ages to negotiate, 7 years, we don't have that long. But also, we have a massive service economy within our economy, and their deal isn't quite as good on services for us. So then we go over to the Swiss model. Well, again, that's got problems. They have to accept free movement. It annoys them a lot. And also they make payments. You will hear over the coming years talk, perhaps, of the Ukrainian model. We haven't got a list for you. It's slightly different. They do restrict immigration, but they do also get access to the single market of sorts. So that's why you hear that idea being put around, but we haven't put a list up for you. The problem is, right now, we don't know any of these. She's saying she wants us to be creative. That's why at the moment we're bobbing around in the middle. Two problems for Theresa May. The first is that come 2019, it will be the EU that tell us which of these models they will allow us to have. Of course, they will want to carry on selling things to us, but nonetheless, it's going to be up to them. And the second thing is that come 2019, a lot of Tory MPs don't want her to still be around. Robert.
Thanks, Allegra. I'm delighted that Chuka and Katie are still with me. I'm still not 100% sure about where Ken is. But anyway, look, we've just heard about these different models that currently exist for trading with the EU. The Prime Minister said on Friday she wants something completely different because we're so different from every other country. Do you have the faintest idea what she means, Chuka?
Well, I don't think she's going to get it for transition. I've spoken to a number of European governments, and what they will want is a model that kind of already exists. You're not going to be able to get a bespoke.
Yeah, but I think she signed up for that. I'm talking
about
post-transition. She's saying she doesn't want Canada. She doesn't want Norway. She thinks we can have something completely different from everybody else. Can we have something different?
I'm not so sure we can, but we should be ambitious. We're the 5th biggest economy in the world, 2nd biggest military power in Europe, etc. But her biggest problem is there was a whole set of promises made to the British public upon which a majority of people who participated in the referendum voted to leave. And those are impossible to deliver. So take the £350 million extra per week for the NHS that Boris went around in that red bus promising everybody. We know that is a load of nonsense. In fact, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said that it's going to cost us 300 million to leave. That is the impact that you will see on the Exchequer every week. And this is her problem, is she, Brexit in the form that it was sold to people is impossible to deliver. And what she's trying to do is square the circle, and she can't.
Katie, one of the things that the Prime Minister did acknowledge is that the kind of trading relationship she wants in perpetuity with the EU would require us to make sure that the rules that affect British business are consistent with fair play in respect of the European single market. And she's saying she doesn't want the European Court of Justice to rule on that. She doesn't want British courts to rule on that. She wants some new extraterritorial body to be created. She hasn't said what it is that would rule on that. Why, for the Brexit wing of your party, is having, in a sense, law made, I said in a blog actually last week, effectively on the moon, better than having law made in Brussels?
Because they feel that people voted to take back control. And
but they're not taking back control. If it's still not being made by the British Parliament and British courts, you're not taking back control, are you?
Well, that's the point, that actually they want to get to a point where British people do have that power to make those decisions themselves. And I think
she's actually said exactly the opposite.
I think she might move from that. I'm not sure that the Brexiteers will stick with that for the next 2 years. But those people that say, like Chuka, who wants to stay within the single market, on your show a couple of months ago, the Shadow Chancellor said that staying within the single market actually would be going against the will of the British people when they showed the referendum. So, I would love to stay within the single market, and I would like to keep things as closely as we can as we are. I was more of a Remainer than a lot of people within the Conservative Party. But I'm not sure you can square that, to coin your phrase. And I think that can be difficult. But moving forward, it's about the choices. And I think that the reason why Theresa May is walking a very, very thin tightrope. And at some point, she has to come over on one side of the fence or the other. And at the moment, she's got the party going in the right direction. She's broken the deadlock. It's now time for the EU to come forward and say what they want from this negotiation.
And now, if we just get it back to the future of Theresa May herself, within your party, it's been taken for granted that she would go after March 30, 2019, when formally we're out of the EU. but there's going to be a lot to negotiate during the transition. Do you think she's just extended her term of office by another 2 years?
Quite possibly. She always said she was there for as long as people want her there. And it's for them to come forward and show an alternative. And I don't see that at the moment. I don't see around the cabinet table a real push. Maybe a few days after the election, some of the Sunday papers have said that they all clamoured together, but I think that that's settled down. There's no push to take over. What do you reckon, Sugar? How long is she going to last?
I think she'll probably...
Gary, you've got 5 seconds.
She'll get to the deal and then she'll go, if there's a deal.
Thanks to my marvellous guests. That's all we've got time for.
Now, Brexit is, of course, the defining political issue of our time, and it's causing the biggest headache right now for the government. But this week, Labour's position, or, as some might say, lack of one, on some of the big questions about life after the EU will also come into focus. As I mentioned earlier, 30 MPs, along with other high-profile figures from the party, have signed a letter urging Mr Corbyn to commit to staying in the single market and the customs union after Brexit. Now, if you are a little confused about the Labour Party's current position on Brexit, don't worry, because Elizabeth Glinka has been taking a look.
In a perfect world, in a perfect world, in a perfect world.
In the week that Theresa was in Florence,
Show me the money!
And Donald was at the UN, the Sunday Politics has been catching up with one of our favourite shows, the long-running saga, the Labour Party's policy on Brexit. The plot lines are all over the place, though. I mean, it's a bit confusing. One minute they want to stay in the single market.
The damage that would be done to our economy by pulling out of the single market at this time could be substantial.
Next thing you know, leaving's the only option.
So the Labour position is this, is we leave the European Union. As leaving the European Union, it means we need to leave the single market.
Not everyone agrees, though.
We wouldn't want to leave membership of the single market.
We've not even started on the customs union yet. Why is it all so unclear?
Jeremy Corbyn will talk next week in his conference speech about a jobs-first Brexit, which kind of doesn't mean very much. It sounds quite good. It's not a hard Brexit, it's not a soft Brexit, it's not blocking Brexit, it's not encouraging Brexit. It's very ambiguous, and Jeremy Corbyn is quite happy for it to stay so. Labour's going to be on the sidelines, criticising the government, saying they're doing things wrong, saying they're taking unnecessary risks, but never quite saying you need to stop this process, and only kind of nudging with a barge pole now and again.
But then this guy, his part's been getting a lot bigger lately.
What we've said is the transitional period, i.e. from March 2019 until we get to a new and final deal, will be within a customs union and within the single market. It's not a U-turn, it's a development of our policy.
Well, that seems clearer, and it's going down well with Labour Remainers.
Well, I welcome the announcement made by Keir Starmer a few weeks ago that Labour believed that the UK should stay in the single market and the customs union for any transition period. I think that's common sense. I voted for Article 50 because that's what the referendum dictated. But equally, I don't think that should mean that MPs start saying things that they don't believe to be true. And I think, my experience of my own constituents is people respect that you say what you believe rather than saying things that you don't believe to be true.
But there are Labour MPs who just want to get on with leaving. This could come to a head.
Sadly, the Labour Party's had a number of positions, different from bench spokespeople have said different things. Jeremy Corbyn has made it clear that the Labour Party is going to implement the decision of the referendum to leave the European Union, and that means leaving the internal market and leaving the customs union. That, I believe, is what the Labour Party position should be and is.
I'm not sure they're all reading off the same script, but there is another plot twist due at conference this week. The Labour campaign for free movement has a motion which it's hoping will be debated. It calls on the party to support continued free movement even when we leave the EU.
Well, look, when people voted for Brexit or voted on the basis of ending free movement, even when they said that, very often the issues that they were talking about were I can't afford a house, I can't get access to decent public services or the NHS, I can't get a job that pays me well, and my children can't afford to get a decent education. Now, our job as a party, as a movement, isn't necessarily to agree with people that those problems are caused by immigrants, because they aren't caused by immigrants.
And here he is, Jeremy Corbyn.
That's a view that's shared by many new Labour members, but is it one Jeremy Corbyn endorses?
A lot of the young people who are going along to his rallies, who are enthused by him, who he has brought into politics in a way, they don't want to see a nationalist, inward-looking country. They want Britain to be an outward-looking country, they want us to be engaged with the world, and I'm sure he's conscious of that despite his long-held traditional Euroscepticism, and he'll be weighing that up as we go forward.
You know, I'm not sure how this one's going to work out. I think it might go to a second series.
That was Elizabeth Glinker reporting. Well, as you heard there, several motions have been submitted to conference this week, which, if they were selected and then carried, would commit Labour to continuing free movement after Brexit. That's something the party explicitly said it would end in its manifesto. Well, the Labour MP Clive Lewis is a signatory to the campaign to keep free movement, and he joins me now, as does his fellow MP Caroline Flint, who disagrees. Now, we won't know until this evening whether or not this is actually going to be debated at conference and whether policy will be being set here. But let's talk about the principles of it. Clive Lewis, why have you signed up to this campaign that wants to not only keep but extend free movement?
Let's explain what the extension of the freedom of movement means. It actually means about giving working people more rights at work, better trade union representation. We have some of the most draconian anti-trade union legislation in the Western world. Sectoral bargaining, something that has been stripped away from many sectors of the economy. To understand that the issue about freedom of movement, people's insecurity, doesn't stem from workers moving around Europe. It stems from the fact that people have had their rights at work taken away from them, and that's happened over the last 35 years, and that's what it comes down to.
In terms of EU citizens who've been free to come and work here and live here at the moment whilst we've been members of the EU, you want that to continue as the same freedoms to come here and work?
With the increased rights and responsibilities that people would have under the Freedom Movement Plus.
So that's completely different from the manifesto you've got the election campaign on. That said explicitly, freedom of movement will end.
There was a manifesto in 1945. We don't stick to that either.
This was 3 months ago.
But the thing is, manifestos evolve and change. And the one thing we've seen with Europe is that it is constantly evolving. I mean, Theresa May has now set out a new position which has mimicked where the Labour Party moved to a few weeks ago. This is a constantly changing process, partly because the rhetoric of Brexit is now coming up against the reality of Brexit. And I think it's quite right and proper that we're at this place, of all places, where we've had a big argument about the democracy of the party. We can argue about a very, very important issue to members and this country as a whole.
It's a debate you want to see happen here in Brighton, is it, Caroline?
I think the Labour Party should have more discussion about immigration, not only in terms of within the EU, but outside of that as well. We haven't got enough resources in the Home Office and the services and people who work in our immigration departments to do the job they should be doing. I supported ID cards. I think it was a mistake to get rid of those. But in terms of freedom, sorry, Sarah, in terms of where we are on freedom of movement, at the referendum, not a long time ago, part of the reason people voted to leave, and a majority did win on that occasion to leave, was that they wanted more control over immigration. And interestingly, something like 1 in 4 of Remain voters also wanted changes to freedom of movement. I'm one of those people as well. So the idea that somehow, as we leave the European Union, we should keep this all intact, I just don't think will be acceptable to the British people.
What changes do you want to see? What restrictions do you want to see put on EU citizens' right to come and live and work in the UK?
Well, I think we should have better control of managed migration. This is what Diane Abbott's talked about. It's actually what Jeremy's talked about as well, and Keir, in the way that our industries and sectors, we look more closely at what the needs are. And this is not about saying we'll have no migration. I'm not up for that. My constituents aren't up for that. But we should be able to manage it. And if we feel in certain areas more could be done within our own country to train and recruit workers here, and employers should do more of that, then I think that's giving us control to say what the limits should be. Now, the problem is we don't have that control at the moment, and that is one of the very issues that the public decided on when they decided to vote to leave.
Which is the point, Clive Lewis, isn't it? By saying you want to maintain freedom of movement, you're probably on the wrong side of the electorate.
I don't know. There's a whole gambit of policies and positions to make the case about as we now enter into this critical phase of Brexit. And I mean, on the issue of people from Europe taking jobs in this country, I think you have to kind of understand, first of all, it's about 0.19% in the last year of the population, a 65.5 million population in this country that came from Europe, and it's falling. And I think the other thing to say as well is those people who, if we want to have an immigration policy or restrictions on the freedom of movement, which make European citizens second-class citizens in effect, giving them biometric data cards, making sure they have less rights at work in effect, then what you're going to do in the end is pull down everyone's terms and conditions. Because the reason I say that is when my dad came to this country in the 1960s, along with millions of other black people from the West Indies and the subcontinent, they had rights and protections at work. They weren't able to be pared away and split away from the majority of the workforce. And consequently, in the 1960s and 70s, there were racial tensions, but they weren't pushed to the limit because there was no kind of divide and conquer that was enabled. So the Freedom Movement Plus is about saying that we want to raise up the rights of all workers, the security of all working people in this country.
I'm sure Caroline Flint agrees with there being plenty of protections for workers' rights, but the question on immigration tends to hang around numbers. Yes. Are there too many EU migrants working in Britain at the moment?
I don't think it's that sort of, if you like, that sort of black and white issue in terms of numbers. What I do think is, clearly there are concerns about pressures in different areas and sectors, and particularly concerns in some of the low-skill, low-pay sector, where in some respects a steady supply of migrant workers, and I don't blame the migrant workers at all in this, I think some employers have taken advantage of that. I think possibly that has contributed to employers increasing zero-hour contracts. I think there are other pressures as well in terms of housing and our health service too. But I think we have to ask ourselves, if you have a managed migration system for people living outside of the EU, many people from our Commonwealth countries, why, as we leave the EU, wouldn't we have a managed migration system for those within the EU coming to work here as well?
It's because of economic comparative advantage, and to put that in English, basically the economies of Europe are far closer to ours. So if, for example, you had open borders with, let's say, Bangladesh, for example, then you're going to see people coming to this country working for a very, very small amount of money, and it will completely destabilise the economy. So I guess my only point is the freedom of movement in the UK, within the European Union, is about economies which are quite comparative. The number of people coming in to this country, 0.2%, is very, very small.
But look, we know, everyone's talked about pressures. Tony Blair, 6-7 months ago said immigration is a problem. More recently, he has been saying, I recognise there's been some issues here. People are saying quite clearly, MEPs, that we didn't enforce some of the rules on freedom of movement. I get that. I have to say some of these people weren't shouting about that at the time. David Cameron went to the Commission, went to the EU and said, please give us some changes. They sent him back with a slapped hand. And the public made a decision here, and we have to be very mindful of our democracy and what people want. It's not an end to migration, but it's actually having more control, and that's what people voted for.
Where do you think the leadership is on this? Because it's a little bit vague what Jeremy Corbyn or John McDonnell has said in the past. Inevitably in this century we will have open borders. Are the leadership with you on this, Clive?
I think it's a work in progress. And I think, look, one of the things that Jeremy Corbyn and myself, from supporting him from day dot, was that we wanted to see a less top-down kind of command and control party.
Right, so you want the party to make the decision. But
one of the consequences...
Caroline, where do you think that leadership would like the policy to be?
Look, I think...
Flexibility. They want maximum flexibility, I think. Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
That's something that you can mansplaining that for me. So anyway,
I was waiting for you to say that to me.
Anyway, now that agreement and harmony has broken out, now that we have a nest of singing birds in the studio here, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both very much.